Cassandra Blackwell has always thought that her marriage to Richard was like building a painting, stroke by stroke. At first, everything looked perfect, but over time, the colors began to fade, and the invisible cracks became more and more visible. They got married 9 years ago, and at first their relationship seemed almost fairy tale-like. She was a creative person with her own art gallery, and he was a confident real estate entrepreneur. However, things began to change gradually as Richard's success became his only goal. The more he earned, the further he moved away from Cassandra. They lived in a cozy house in a small town in Georgia. The place seemed perfect for starting a family, but unfortunately, they never had any children in their marriage. Cassandra felt that this was not just a coincidence, but another sign that their bond was breaking down. She spent most of her time in her gallery, drowning her emotions in art, while Richard was constantly on the road. Their communication was reduced to superficial discussions of plans for the week and exchanging common phrases before bed. One morning, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, Cassandra heard the sound of an incoming message on her phone. It was her younger sister, Elaine Carter, announcing her arrival in town. "Hi, sister. I'm staying with you for a few weeks. I need to get some rest. I hope you don't mind. See you tonight." It was a surprise, but Cassandra couldn't say no. It was as impossible to say no to Elaine as it was to stop the summer rain. Her sister was always the one who got what she wanted, no matter what the situation. As a child, her parents had openly favored Elaine, so Cassandra was left to be the one to give in. Richard walked into the kitchen just as Cassandra put her phone down on the table. "What's wrong?" he asked, barely looking up from his phone screen. "Elaine's coming," Cassandra replied dryly, hiding her irritation. "Elaine?" he asked, something like curiosity flashing across his face. "Maybe it would be for the best, a little livening up for us." Cassandra felt something uneasy creep into her thoughts. Since Elaine had moved to New York a few years ago, they hadn't seen each other much. Their communication was limited to phone calls and occasional visits. Yet, despite the distance, Elaine always had a way of showing up at the most inopportune times. That evening, when Elaine crossed the threshold of their home, Cassandra immediately felt that things would not go as she would have liked. Her sister, smiling and radiant, hugged her and Richard as if she were a part of their lives every day. Her appearance brought with it not only warmth, but also some unwelcome tension. "Richard, you look just fine," Elaine said, holding her gaze on him a little longer than she should have. There was nothing explicit in her words, but Cassandra noticed that Richard responded to the compliment with too much gratitude. From that moment on, their interactions began to cause her concern. Richard suddenly became more attentive to Elaine than to his wife. He offered to help her with things, took an interest in her life, and once even agreed to go for a walk with her, leaving Cassandra alone at home. These small moments left behind a feeling of discomfort that grew inside Cassandra like a heavy stone on her soul. She tried to find a logical explanation for their behavior, but every new detail only deepened her suspicions. One evening was particularly disturbing. The three of them were sitting in the living room having a glass of wine when Elaine suddenly asked, "Are you and Richard thinking about traveling? It would be nice to go somewhere together, to relax." Richard smiled and looked at his sister Cassandra. "That sounds like a good idea, isn't it, Cassandra?" She felt her heart beat faster. It was one of those moments when it seems like everyone around you knows something they're not telling you. "Maybe," she replied dryly and faked a smile. The feeling of strangeness did not leave her all night. Lying next to Richard in bed, she stared at the ceiling, listening to her husband breathe softly in his sleep. Her suspicions were now almost tangible. Something was going on behind her back, and she had to find out what it was. The next day, the situation only got worse. Elaine stayed for lunch at Cassandra's gallery, and while sitting over a cup of coffee, she began to talk about her recent adventures in New York. At some point, she mentioned her difficulties with money. "To be honest, things aren't going as well as they seem," she admitted with a shrug. "Maybe that's why I'm here. I wanted to take a break from all these problems." Cassandra nodded, but inwardly she was increasingly suspicious that her sister's problems were not limited to finances. Richard also seemed to be involved in this tangle, and she began to feel that her marriage was in jeopardy. Now, all these little things, Glances, hints, remarks seemed like important pieces of the puzzle, but Cassandra didn't know how to put them together. Every night, her thoughts grew darker and her suspicions deeper. She felt that her life, which she had been trying to hold on to for so long, was about to collapse. And at some point, it became clear that she had to find out the truth, even if it meant the end of her marriage. Although she didn't know what lay ahead, her intuition told her that something terrible was already at her doorstep. Each new day that Elaine arrived brought more anxiety to Cassandra's life. Her suspicions, which at first were only faint hints, now took on a concrete form. She could see Richard and Elaine exchanging glances, sharing those small moments between them that usually belong only to those closest to them. Cassandra felt like an outsider in her own home, as if she were being pushed out gradually but steadily, and the more she watched them, the more she felt threatened. One morning, when Richard disappeared for work again, Elaine stayed home with Cassandra. They were drinking coffee on the terrace, and Elaine looked completely carefree, as if everything that was happening around her was just a game. Cassandra, on the other hand, was as tense as a string. She noticed her sister's every move, her every word, trying to figure out where the lies lay. "Don't you think sometimes people need something new?" Elaine suddenly asked, looking away into the distance. Her words sounded casual, but there was something disturbing in them. "Maybe," Cassandra answered dryly, trying not to let her emotions show. "But sometimes it's better to keep what you have." Elaine gave her a quick glance and smiled slightly, as if she knew something Cassandra had yet to discover. It was the smile she had seen in her childhood when her sister had beaten her at something important. And now Cassandra felt that the same game was still going on. But this time there was more at stake than just childish arguments. Her marriage was at stake. That very day, Cassandra decided to take action. She went to her friend, Tanya Johnson, whom she trusted more than anyone else. Tanya had known Cassandra since her university days and had always been there for her, especially in difficult moments. They met in a small cafe near Cassandra's gallery. "I can't take it anymore, Tanya," Cassandra confessed, holding a cup of hot tea. "They act like I don't exist anymore, like my house is no longer mine." Tanya nodded, listening intently. She knew that when Cassandra started to suspect something, she was usually right. "I think there's something between them," Cassandra added quietly, "but I can't prove it." "Maybe you're just tired," Tanya suggested cautiously, though she didn't believe it herself. She knew that Cassandra's intuition rarely failed her. "You should gather more information before you jump to conclusions." Cassandra shook her head. "They're too close, Tanya. And I'm afraid this is just the beginning." That evening was another test for Cassandra's nerves. Richard and Elaine came home late, discussing something that made them laugh out loud. They looked overly happy together, much happier than Richard had ever looked with Cassandra in recent times. Her heart clenched with pain, and she realized she couldn't take it anymore. When Richard went to take a shower, Cassandra quietly crept over to his phone, which was on the table. Her hands trembled as she opened the screen. She knew it was wrong, but she didn't care. She had to know the truth, even if it hurt. And the truth was not long in coming. She found a few messages from Elaine, short but telling enough. "I can't wait to get together. You make me feel special. When are you going to tell her?" These words were like a stab in the back. Cassandra clutched the phone in her hands, trying to hold back her tears. Everything had fallen into place. She had no more doubts. Her husband was cheating on her with her own sister. She put the phone back down and went to her room without saying a word. That night, she barely slept, trying to figure out what to do next. Her world was falling apart before her eyes, and she didn't know how to put it back together. The next few days passed in a blur. Cassandra felt trapped. She couldn't tell Richard or Elaine that she knew the truth, but every look at them, every moment they shared together was unbearable for her. She felt betrayed, humiliated, and confused. Meanwhile, Richard didn't even seem to notice how his wife was moving away from him. He continued to meet with Elaine behind Cassandra's back, thinking that his secret would never be exposed. But Cassandra already knew everything, and now she had to decide what to do with this truth. One night, as the three of them sat at dinner, Elaine gave Cassandra a special look, the same look that always meant victory. It was the moment when Cassandra realized she could take it no longer. She had to act, and act fast, before these two completely destroyed everything she held dear. Her plan began to take shape in her mind, like a puzzle finally coming together. She didn't know all the details yet, but she was sure of one thing: she wouldn't let them ruin her life with impunity. And now it was only a matter of time. Every day that passed brought new reasons for suspicion, but it also brought Cassandra closer to the moment when she would be able to put everything in its place. The shadow of tension and fear hung over her home like a thunderstorm about to break. She knew something was about to happen, and that something would change everything forever. The day dragged on slowly, like sticky honey. Cassandra woke up early, with a slight feeling of tension in her chest. Her plan was almost ready, but she had to wait for the right moment. She no longer had the strength to watch her husband and sister steal her life piece by piece, but she had to play her part to the end calmly and without suspicion. That morning she behaved as usual. She made breakfast and sat down silently next to Richard. He quickly sipped his coffee without even looking up from his phone. Each sip was unbearable for Cassandra, as if a knife blade was cutting deeper into her heart. "I'm going to see Tanya today," she said suddenly, trying to keep her voice calm. "I need a change of scenery." Richard looked up, but his expression was indifferent. He didn't even try to hide the fact that he was relieved to hear the news. "That's a good idea," he said vaguely, his eyes sliding to the phone. Cassandra smiled, though her insides were seething. She knew he'd been waiting for this moment. As soon as she left the house, he would meet Elaine. Throughout the day, Cassandra pretended to prepare for the trip, packing her suitcase, calling Tanya to make an appointment, leaving Richard instructions on how to take care of the house. Her plan was thought out to the smallest detail. Before leaving, she stopped at the living room mirror and took one last look at herself. She looked as she always did, impeccably composed and cool. "I'm leaving," she said as she passed Richard. "I'll be on the road for a few hours." "Okay, call me when you get there," he replied without even looking up. Cassandra nodded and left the house, leaving her husband alone. She slowly walked out to her car, started the engine, and drove toward the highway, but her plan was completely different. She stopped a few blocks from the house, turned off the engine, and waited. Meanwhile, back at the house, as she had predicted, Richard wasted no time. He sent a message to Elaine, inviting her to come over. He knew Cassandra wouldn't be back anytime soon, and now they could spend the evening together. Everything looked perfect. Cassandra was away, and he and Elaine could enjoy each other's company without fear of being found out. A few hours later, when the sun had already set and the night was gradually enveloping the city, Elaine appeared on the doorstep. Her face was radiant and a smile played on her lips. They were confident that their secret would go unnoticed. Richard opened the door and immediately pulled her inside. They sat down in the living room, pouring wine and discussing plans for the future, as if nothing could go wrong. They thought they had everything under control. But the night held other plans. A few hours later, when Richard was alone, something happened that he could not have predicted. He sat on the couch, thinking about how quickly everything had changed. He no longer thought about Cassandra. She seemed to him only a shadow of the past. Suddenly, he heard a sound in the backyard, a light rustle that broke the silence of the house. He got up from the couch, looking around nervously. He thought someone was behind the door, but when he looked closely, he saw nothing. Richard went back to the living room, but the feeling of anxiety did not disappear. He went to the kitchen and turned off the light, hoping it was just his imagination. But something was wrong. At that moment, the lights went out. The house was pitch black. Richard was confused, picking up his phone to turn on the flashlight, but before he could do anything, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around, but it was too late. A knife flashed in the darkness, and Richard fell to the floor with a muffled scream. The blood quickly spread under his body, and the house was once again enveloped in ominous silence. When the police arrived a few hours after the anonymous call, they found Richard's body in the kitchen. He had a deep cut on his chest that left no chance of survival. All signs pointed to a cold-blooded murder. Detectives Marcus Gray and Linda Hall, who were the first to arrive at the scene, began to consider possible motives. Who would want Richard Blackwell dead? His wife was on her way to Atlanta at the time of the murder, Marcus said, looking over the list of suspects. That narrows it down, but something still doesn't seem right. Maybe it was a random crime, Linda suggested, looking at the footprints at the scene, although it looks like the killer knew him. Marcus shook his head. His experience told him that there was something personal about this crime. He felt that the answer lay somewhere close at hand, and only a small detail would help complete the picture. They knew one thing: this case was not that simple. And as their experience has shown, the most important answers are often hidden in the smallest details. Richard's murder was the beginning of a complex investigation. His death forever changed the dynamics in the lives of everyone who was connected to him. But for now, the real motive and killer remained in the shadows. The next morning, the town of Georgia was filled with an uneasy atmosphere. The death of Richard Blackwell had shaken a community that had been accustomed to a calm, measured life. The house where the murder took place was now surrounded by police cars and tape cordoning off the crime scene. Detectives Marcus Gray and Linda Hall were at the scene, carefully examining every detail that might help solve the crime. "Something's not right here," Marcus muttered as he studied the knife found next to the body. No signs of a struggle, not even chaos. It looks like someone knew what they were doing. "Yeah, and it doesn't look like a robbery," Linda added, leaning closer to the knife. "Interesting that the wife was in another city. But sometimes what seems obvious is just a smokescreen." She stood up and looked at several photos taken at the crime scene. According to the preliminary analysis, Richard had been killed by a precise blow to the chest. This indicated that the killer was cold-blooded and acted without hesitation. "We need statements from everyone who knew him intimately," Linda said. Cassandra returned from a trip the same morning she learned of her husband's murder. She looked shocked, but tried to keep her composure. She was met at the house of her friend Tanya, where she spent the night. "Mrs. Blackwell, we need to ask you a few questions," Marcus began, watching her reactions carefully. "Of course," Cassandra replied quietly. "I just can't believe this happened. Richard was... We had our difficulties, of course, but I never meant him any harm. Can you tell me about your relationship with him lately?" Linda asked, looking at her calmly. Cassandra sighed and shrugged her shoulders. "We went through some difficult times, like any married couple, but nothing serious. We didn't fight before I left, if that's what you mean." "You said you went to visit a friend in Atlanta?" Marcus clarified. "I spent the night at Tanya Johnson's. You can check it out." Marcus and Linda exchanged glances. Alba found her story believable, but something in her tone didn't seem so simple to Marcus. "What about your sister Elaine?" Linda asked. "Were you close with her?" Cassandra pressed her lips together, trying to remain calm. "Elaine was in town for a few weeks. She was just staying with us. You know, we haven't always gotten along, but she's my sister." Marcus watched her reaction carefully, sensing that she was not telling him something. "We'll look into the details," he said, closing his notebook. "Thank you for your time." When Cassandra left, Linda leaned over to Marcus. "Something's not right here." "Yes, I noticed that too," Marcus replied. "She either has great emotional control or she's hiding something." The detectives next called Elaine in for questioning. She appeared at the police station dressed elegantly and with a somewhat arrogant expression on her face, as if she was not afraid of the police or suspicion. "We know that you were close to Richard," Marcus began. "Can you tell us about your last encounters with him?" Elaine thought for a moment, as if trying to find the right words. "We were friends," she said, smiling softly. "I knew him for a long time, but nothing more, if that's what you're asking." "Did you spend a lot of time together during your stay here?" Linda clarified, watching the reaction carefully. "We met a few times, yes," Elaine answered. Marcus felt that her answers sounded too cautious. "Did your sister know about your meetings with Richard?" he asked. "Of course not," Elaine laughed nervously. "I was just helping him with some questions." The detectives exchanged glances again, their suspicions about Elaine growing. The next day, the detectives received new information. One of the neighbors, Mike Harris, confessed to seeing Elaine and Richard together the night of the murder. "They looked really close," Mike said when questioned. "I saw them go into the house together, and then I heard some noise, but I didn't pay much attention to it." This testimony added a new dimension to the investigation. Detectives now knew that Elaine was with Richard that night. But was she involved in his death, or did someone else take advantage of the situation? During the inspection of the house, Linda noticed a small but important detail. At the crime scene, they found a fingerprint on a bracelet that was lying in the living room. It was the same bracelet that Cassandra had found in Richard's car earlier. "This could be the key," Linda said, showing Marcus the discovery. "If we can find out who this print belongs to, we can open up a new version of the case." Marcus examined the bracelet closely and again felt the same intuitive feeling that the key to the case had not yet been fully revealed. "Let's have it tested in the lab," he said. The investigation continued, but the detectives did not yet know how close they were to the solution. They still had to complete the puzzle, and they felt that the truth was very close. Detectives Marcus Gray and Linda Hall worked without rest. Each new fact and each testimony added new nuances to the case, but none of the suspects fit the image of the killer perfectly. They gathered enough data to realize that there was more going on between the participants in this story than at first glance. However, the final motive remained unclear, and key evidence was scattered. The first important discovery was a fingerprint on a bracelet found in the living room. Forensic analysis showed that the print belonged to Richard, which meant that he had come into contact with the jewelry shortly before his death. But why did this bracelet, which Elaine always wore, end up at the crime scene in such a suspicious way? Even more interesting was the fact that there were no obvious prints on the knife used to kill Richard. It had been carefully wiped clean. Whoever committed the murder knew exactly what they were doing. Detectives also collected several text messages from Richard's phone. Most of them were from Elaine, but there were a few calls from an unknown number on the eve of his death. The investigation revealed that this number was blocked on Cassandra's phone. This further strengthened the suspicions against her, although her alibi seemed reliable. The detectives decided to talk again to a neighbor, Mike Harris, who had seen Richard and Elaine together on the night of the murder. This time, Mike was willing to provide more details. "I didn't want to interfere," he began, looking nervously at the detectives, "but I heard them arguing that night. Not just arguing, but yelling at each other. It sounded like something very serious was going on between them." "Are you sure it was Richard and Elaine?" Linda clarified. "I heard their voices. They were talking about money and threats. I didn't understand the details, but it was definitely something very personal. This testimony has changed the picture of what happened. Perhaps Richard and Elaine had a fight, and the quarrel ended in tragedy. However, the question still remained, who was the actual killer? The police checked the calls and messages between Cassandra and her friend Tanya Johnson. They had indeed exchanged messages about the trip, but one thing confused Marcus: the time of the last call. Cassandra had supposedly left town around 7 p.m., but her phone recorded her in the area of her home until 9 p.m. This contradicted her words and cast doubt on her alibi. Marcus called Tanya in for questioning to find out more. Cassandra was indeed supposed to arrive that evening, Tanya confirmed, but she arrived much later than she had planned, around 11 o'clock at night. "Why so late? Did she explain?" Marcus asked. "She said she just got lost and went to the wrong place," Tanya answered with a shrug. This testimony was extremely important. If Cassandra was in the neighborhood later than she claimed, it could mean that she had the opportunity to return and commit the crime. Another interesting point was the call from a hidden number that came to Richard's phone an hour before he died. The police were able to trace the call to a vending machine on the street near the house. This could be an indication that someone wanted to meet with Richard and leave no trace. Linda decided to review the surveillance footage from the street. Although most of the footage was fuzzy, one of them captured a female figure approaching a vending machine. She was wearing a long cloak and hat that hid her face. Detectives were unable to identify the woman, but this added to the intrigue. Meanwhile, the new facts pushed the detectives to investigate Elaine's role in the murder even further. It turned out that she had serious financial problems. Several creditors threatened to sue her if she did not pay off her debts in the near future. This could have been a motive to blackmail Richard, or even kill him if he refused to help her. If Richard wasn't going to help her financially, she might have gotten angry, Marcus suggested, and if they did have a fight that night, that could have been the trigger. Linda nodded, but her eyes remained doubtful. But if it was her, why does it look like someone was trying to frame Cassandra? This question remained unanswered. All the facts suggested that each of the suspects could have had a motive, but something about the case defied logic. During a closer inspection of the kitchen, the detectives discovered that one of the knives in the set that belonged to Cassandra was missing. It was a knife similar to the one used to kill Richard. This discovery raised even more questions. Could the killer have taken the knife in advance? And if so, who had access to the kitchen? Marcus and Linda reviewed all possible scenarios. Their intuition told them that things were not as simple as they seemed. Something important still remained hidden. A small, seemingly insignificant detail that could reveal everything. We need to talk to Cassandra again, Marcus decided. I feel like she's hiding something. She may not have killed Richard, but she definitely knows more than she's telling us. Linda agreed. Their suspicion of Cassandra was growing, even though they had no direct evidence against her. But one thing was clear. This love triangle was hiding more than they first thought, and the most important detail had not yet been discovered. The detectives knew they were getting closer to the solution, but the question remained. Will they have time to collect all the evidence before the truth slips away from them again into the darkness? Marcus Gray and Linda Hall were convinced that the answer to the intricate mystery was at hand, but they were missing one important detail. Every piece of evidence pointed to the fact that all three characters in the drama Cassandra, Elaine, and Richard had been hiding something more than they were saying. Nothing in this case was accidental. When the detectives put all the pieces of the puzzle together, they felt they were close to the truth, but they still had to prove it. Marcus and Linda decided to talk to Cassandra again. Her behavior left many questions. She seemed calm and controlled her emotions better than someone who had lost a husband. Mrs. Blackwell, we know that you were in town on the night of the murder longer than you originally said, Marcus began, watching her reaction carefully. Cassandra was embarrassed for a moment, but quickly composed herself. Yes, I stayed longer, but that doesn't mean I had anything to do with Richard's death. I was just driving away, but I needed some time to collect my thoughts. Linda leaned forward. You knew your husband and sister were having an affair, right? You saw the messages on his phone. Cassandra remained silent, her face filled with pain she could no longer hide. Yes, I knew, she finally admitted. I found out a few days before he died, but I didn't want a scandal. I just wanted to get away from it all, go to my friend's house, and think about what to do next. Marcus and Linda exchanged glances. Her words seemed true, but there were still doubts. She might know more than she was telling. Meanwhile, Elaine became increasingly confused in her testimony. She claimed to have had no conflicts with Richard, but their messages and the testimony of her neighbor Mike suggested otherwise. Elaine admitted that she was having financial difficulties and hoped that Richard would help her. I asked him for help, but he refused, she said. We had a fight, but that was it. But you were with him the night of the murder, Marcus reminded her. You had access to the knife from the kitchen, and you had a motive. I left the house when he was alone, Elaine replied nervously. Marcus and Linda realized that Elaine was hiding something, but there was still a lack of direct evidence to point to her as the killer. At this point, the detectives received the results of additional examinations. No prints were found on the knife used to kill Richard, but under the microscope, they found fabric fibers that matched the sweater Cassandra was wearing that evening. It shows that she at least touched the knife, Linda summarized, but it doesn't prove that she killed him. However, this was enough to call Cassandra in for questioning again. This time, under the pressure of the evidence, Cassandra could no longer keep a secret. She admitted that she had returned to the house on the night of the murder. I saw Elaine coming out of the house. She was furious and Richard was still inside. I went in to talk to him. I wanted to understand why he had betrayed me with my sister. Her voice trembled, but she continued. We had a fight. He said I didn't mean anything to him anymore, that he was going to Elaine. I lost control. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen. I didn't even realize what I had done until I saw it on the floor. Marcus and Linda listened in silence. You wiped the prints off the knife to avoid suspicion? Asked Marcus. Cassandra nodded. Yes. I tried to think of a way to get out of it. I knew no one would believe me if I said it was an accident, so I decided to just disappear and pretend I wasn't there. The trial of Cassandra Blackwell became an event that was discussed not only in their town, but also far beyond. The press did not miss the opportunity to create a sensation. A woman who killed her husband after learning about his affair with her own sister. Drama, intrigue, and a perfect family that fell apart before our eyes kept the public in suspense until the verdict. The prosecutor's office filed charges of premeditated first-degree murder, claiming that Cassandra had deliberately planned her crime. Cassandra's lawyer, in turn, defended her, emphasizing that the crime was the result of affect, uncontrollable anger and emotions caused by years of humiliation and betrayal. Elaine Carter appeared at the trial as a key witness. Her testimony was twofold. On the one hand, she tried to distance herself from the tragedy, and on the other, her words confirmed that Richard and Cassandra had indeed had a serious conflict. They had been unhappy together for a long time, she said. I don't know exactly what happened that night, but my sister was always on the edge, trying to save something that was already destroyed. Also important was the examination of the knife, which still had fibers of Cassandra's sweater on it. This evidence confirmed that she was holding the knife, although the defense lawyer argued that this did not prove premeditation. After a lengthy hearing and heated debate, the jury reached a verdict of guilty of second-degree murder. The court recognized that the crime was the result of severe emotional distress, but was still a deliberate act of violence. Cassandra was sentenced to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 8 years for good behavior. When the judge read out the sentence, Cassandra stood still. Her face showed neither joy nor sadness, only relief. She knew that this trial was only a formality, because her sentence in her own soul had been passed the night she grabbed the knife. 2 years have passed since the trial. The town of Georgia plunged back into normal everyday life, and the once high-profile Blackwell case remained just a dark page in the town's history. People rarely talked about Cassandra and her crime, although from time to time someone would mention the scandalous story of betrayal and revenge in conversation. Elaine Carter left the city and settled in another state, trying to start her life from scratch. Her financial problems did not disappear, but she avoided responsibility for her role in the tragedy. She did not visit her sister in prison and never mentioned her again. Cassandra was serving her time in a women's colony where she was involved in art. She spent her time painting and teaching classes to other inmates, discovering a new meaning to life. She no longer felt anger or regret, only inner peace that it was over. One day, Cassandra received a letter from Tanya Johnson. Her friend wrote that she was waiting for her after her release, and that life does not end after prison. Those words became a ray of hope for Cassandra. She knew that her life would not return to the way it was, but she would not remain in the darkness of the past. Detectives Marcus Gray and Linda Hall have also moved on to new cases, although from time to time they mentioned this case as an example of how human passion can lead to tragedy. For them, the story remained a lesson. Never underestimate the importance of small details. They often reveal the deepest truths. When Cassandra leaves prison, the world will be completely different for her. However, she is ready to accept this new world, without Richard, without Elaine, but with the belief that even after the darkest nights, there is a morning.